The morning began in unusual quiet at 221B Baker Street, a quiet so complete that even the city's distant rumble seemed to hesitate before crossing the threshold. The hearth had burned itself into soft grey, the embers curled like old paper. Holmes's violin lay upon the table, a single string still trembling with the last residue of a note he must have drawn hours before. His teacup, half full and long since cold, sat untouched beside an unopened telegram whose edge curled upward as if urging someone to read it at last. I had risen early, more from an indistinct sense of unease than from habit, and found myself studying these still objects as if they formed a language only Holmes could decipher. There was something unsettled in the air, a pause between two breaths, the kind that hangs before storms or revelations. And though Holmes was not yet visible, the silence itself carried the contour of his mind, as though he had moved through the room moments earlier, and the air had not recovered from the agitation of his presence. As I crossed toward the mantel, the faintest sound slipped beneath the floorboards, Holmes descending the stairs with a measured slowness that was unlike him. When he emerged, his expression bore the pale concentration I had come to associate with matters that touched upon human cruelty more intimately than he wished to confess. He glanced once at the unopened telegram, then at me, and in that brief exchange I knew the quiet of the morning would not last. A case waited, one written, it seemed, in the very tension of the stillness around us. As I pen this account for those who, over the years, have expressed an uncommon curiosity for the strangest of our adventures, I ask only that you remain attentive, for what begins in silence soon turns toward a darkness sharpened by grief and a truth so delicate that I doubted whether to reveal it at all. Yet every devoted reader deserves the full account, and so I proceed. I do not write of trifles, nor of those small incidents which merely amuse an idle hour. Yet when the morning air itself seemed to carry a message, and the very furniture of 221B Baker Street held its breath, I judged the moment not to be lightly passed over. I had long been inured to Holmes's singularities, to his habit of discarding a teacup half drunk, or leaving the violin upon the table as if the act of music had been an interruption rather than a purpose. Yet that particular morning there was a stillness more articulate than any I had known beneath his roof. The fire had burned to a crust of grey ash that crumbled like old mortar beneath the stiffened poker. The violin upon the chair bore the faint print of its last stroke, a single string humming with the memory of sound. Between the paper and the rail upon which my cap hung lay an unopened telegram, its stiff corners curled in a manner that suggested haste and then abandonment. It was, in short, an object which, under any other circumstances, might have been allowed to pass as a mere domestic query. But for reasons which even then I could not have set in words, it presented itself to me as the fulcrum of events soon to be set in motion. Holmes, when he descended, carried with him that expression which means more than any spoken discourse. Something in the tilt of his head, the line of his jaw, the minute contraction of a nostril, told me he had been contemplating some abstruse problem which had ceased, for the present, to be pure intellectual exercise and had become urgent with human consequence. He cast his quick regard about the room, paused for a single instant upon the half-full cup of tea, and then bent his eyes upon the telegram. There are gestures which are as eloquent as any sentence, and as I watched him break the seal and read, the colour drained a little from his face as if the paper bore, not ink only, but some cold contagion. He folded the sheet with an unsteady hand and pushed it toward me. "Watson," said he, in that low voice which I have learned to trust for its exactness, "we are asked to proffer our services." The summons was brief and yet peculiar in its tone. It came from a Mrs. Eliza Halcombe of Gilston Lane, and the words were those of a woman whose courage had been sundered by some strain beyond ordinary endurance. She spoke, in few hurried phrases, of her late husband, a clockmaker of sober reputation, and of certain circumstances which had rendered his death strange enough to merit inquiry. She begged the presence of one who had knowledge of both delicate machinery and the human heart. There was no flourish, no melodramatic appeal, only the compressed breath of a woman who had written while her hand shook. Holmes read it twice, his thumb smoothing the fiber of the paper as if by such contact he might extract further truth. "It is the voice of distress," he observed, and for once I had the sense that his words carried no irony. We took immediate steps. For if there is a time when appearances must not be postponed, it is when grief hovers about the threshold of a household, and the household itself is an instrument of hidden testimony. Holmes fetched his long coat and his hat with the diligence of a man who prepares his tools before striking. I, with the steadier soul which my medical experience affords, wrapped myself against the keen November air and prepared to follow. The hansom took us through London, which, beneath the low sun, presented a multitude of little dramas. A newsboy with mud upon his knees, a porter who argued with a baker over the tally of bread, an omnibus in which a child was learning its earliest mathematics from a patient nurse. Yet all those noises, those lives, felt extraneous to the hush that had claimed my companion. He sat with his fingers interlaced, regarding the city as one might regard a map of battle where every lane might conceal a hazard. Gilston Lane was an older part of the town where the houses kept their faces toward one another with a certain respectful modesty. The clockmaker's dwelling stood back from the street, its windows small and its sign, whereon a brass pendulum once swung, now dull with rain. The gate protested with a long, querulous creak as we entered the small garden, and upon the step a figure waited whose stoop and pallor bespoke the weight of wakeful nights. Mrs. Halcombe was, in truth, a woman not yet bowed in years, but she carried sorrow with the gravity of someone twice her age. Her dress was of the plainest black, and upon her hand she clutched a handkerchief which had been dampened by tears and then pressed away with the habitual motion of one who will not be seen to weep. Her eyes, however, betrayed her. They were the eyes of a person who has measured the last hour by the absence of a breath, and has found that the measure is insufficient. She led us into a room where the remains of the clockmaker's art were set like bones in a skeleton of a life, benches, tools, brass filings, and the slow, steady tick of clocks that refused to keep concord with one another. The deceased, Mr. Joseph Halcombe, had been known in his neighborhood as a man of exactness, a person for whom time was both trade and faith. His last days, as his widow told them between choked sentences, had been marked by a nervousness she could not name. He would, she said, sit at his bench with his hands folded, and look as if he listened to something which none in the room could hear. On the morning of his death, she declared, he had gone to adjust a large clock which hung in the front parlor and had not returned to the workbench. Later, a neighbor found him upon the floor, the expression upon his face more that of one who had listened to a damnation than of one who had succumbed to natural causes. Holmes moved about the workshop with a surgeon's quiet, his eyes taking in the play of shadow upon the brass and the peculiar disposition of dust upon a shelf. He lifted a small screwdriver and tested the threads of a screw with the same care with which he might have tested a pulse. "He took care with his tools," he murmured. "He left a mechanism half assembled, yet no sign of a struggle, nor of forced entry. Observe, Watson, the dust upon the sill, undisturbed, yet the latch has been handled. There is finesse here, a hand that understood how to touch without leaving the vulgarity of prints." I felt a chill, not for the cold of the room, but for the delicate certainty that the event which had broken the clockmaker's life had been contrived by someone who moved with the manners of the truly practiced. Mrs. Halcombe sat as if the very air had become a foreign element which she inhaled with difficulty. She had, at one time, endeavored to open the telegram, but had, catching herself, folded it away again. "He would not have wished that every question be laid bare to strangers," she said in a voice that quivered like an undecided spring. "Yet I had no one else to whom to go." Her hands trembled when she produced from beneath a shawl a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside it, a watch which had been the deceased's last commission. The crystal was cracked, the hands frozen at a time which did not correspond with any known account of his death. Holmes took the watch with reverent fingers and held it to the window as a man might hold a relic. The light that filtered through the glass seemed to uncover, for a second, the inner geometry of the mechanism, and in that brief revelation, Holmes's face acquired that look of concentrated appetite which I have seen when he has discovered a clue of first importance. "There is more here than mere accident," he said at last, "and it will not be set right by idle conjecture." His hand rested upon the telegram that had lain unopened upon our return. I perceived, with a sensation that was not wholly without dread, that the morning's silence had been but the prelude to a voice that would demand we listen closely to the ticking of other clocks, and to the hesitant confession of a widow who feared both the truth and the world's judgment. The room, filled with the ordinary music of time, seemed suddenly to hold its breath once more, as if the instruments themselves awaited the outcome of some private verdict. Outside, the street moved on in its indifferent commerce. Within, a quieter commerce began, of glances, of held breaths, of the slow, inexorable assembling of detail which would, in time, make a pattern where now lay only fragments. I felt then, with a physician's sober recognition, that a case had opened which would try not only our wits but our temperaments, and that the answer to it would be less a triumph than a weighing of human frailty. The unopened telegram, which had brought us to that very threshold, lay between us like a question poised upon its hinge, and there was no avoiding the moment when it must be lifted and read. We had scarcely left the workshop when the weather, as if in sympathy with the widow's sorrow, drew a thin, persistent rain across the street which hummed upon the hansom's roof like a soft, inexorable clock. Mrs. Halcombe received us in a parlor that seemed less a room than a repository of habits. A coal-scattered grate, a row of clocks ticking in careful descent, and upon a small table a cup of tea gone cold, where the steam had long since surrendered to the air. Her face, when she turned toward us, carried that pale steadiness of one who has decided to adorn courage with commonplace manners. Yet her hands betrayed the effort, moving with the tiny, repetitive motions of someone learning to be still. As she spoke, I noted the faint scent of oil and brass that clung to her skirts, not an odor of the body only, but of a house lived in and made by workmanship, the same scent which had lingered upon her husband's bench. She told us, in sentences trimmed to economy by a mind that had rehearsed its grief, into acceptability, of Joseph Halcombe's life, a man of modest pride who measured his days by the revolutions of fly-wheels and the soft music of escapements. He would rise before the dawn to set a dial, and when the light fell he would sit beneath the lamp to tune a minute hand as if it were a violin. He kept to himself a certain candor. He spoke seldom of business, more often of the exactness of things. Lately, she said, he had been troubled by a secret preoccupation that made him leave his bed at odd hours to pace the workshop as though listening for a sound no one else might perceive. The poor woman shivered when she recounted that at times he seemed to expect a knock that never came, or to look toward the little front parlor as though someone stood there whom she could not see. Holmes listened with that expression of detached attention which in him is always alloyed with the hunger of the chase. He would incline his head half a degree, then draw back as if testing an aroma in the air. He asked the precise questions that extract truth from reticence, the names of those who had visited, the hours at which Mr. Halcombe had last been seen at his bench, the nature of his recent commissions. Mrs. Halcombe answered without embellishment, but her eyes fell often upon the mantel where an empty space betrayed the absence of a small brass object she had once kept there, an object which, she confessed, her husband had said could not be left in the house when business pressed upon him. When Holmes inquired after neighbors and colleagues, she hesitated only when he spoke of Halcombe's apprentice, a youth named Samuel Greaves, whose devotion to the old man had been beyond reproach and whose hands, she assured us, were cleaner than most of the tradesmen in the quarter. I took note of the portraits and prints upon the walls, the frames of which had been polished but not rearranged. They were like memories that had been kept in order even as the life they commemorated faltered. On a narrow shelf lay a small parcel wrapped in oiled paper, which Mrs. Halcombe had brought down from her private drawer with an air of reluctant determination. Inside was a brass stud belonging to a pocket watch, its surface scored by time and the fine abrasion of regular use. "He kept this when he went out," she said, touching it as one might touch the sleeve of a deceased friend. "It belonged to his father. He said some things were not to be parted with." There was in her voice a tenderness which made the most ordinary object seem a relic. Holmes examined the stud as if it were an argument in miniature, holding it between his finger and thumb to the lamplight until the brass caught a warm gleam. He compared it to the cracked watch we had seen in the workshop, and then to the tools upon the bench with the same practiced eye I had so often observed in his handling of chemical reagents. "There are marks here," he muttered. "Not of accident, but of intention. He who handled this knew how to wear it, and also how to conceal the manner in which he had worn it." He spoke the last words half to himself, and in them I perceived the first suggestion that the affair was not merely private sorrow, but involved a skillful, measured interference. Mrs. Halcombe lingered to tell us of a quarrel that had occurred some weeks earlier with a man of whom she could offer little description beyond the fact that he had an easy manner and a penchant for late hours. The clockmaker had dismissed him as a collector who fancied curious mechanisms and refused later to mention him by name. "My husband was proud but not showy," she said, folding and refolding her hands until the movement took on the calm of ritual. "If there was a dispute, it was about whether to keep certain designs private. Joseph believed some things were too dangerous to let loose." The word danger trembled in the room like a note sustained below hearing, and as Holmes's eyes passed over the widow, I thought that his interest sharpened in proportion to the timbre of her fear. It was then that the sound began. Not a scream, nor even a sharp exclamation, but the low metallic cadence of a clock that had found, unaccountably, a new rhythm. The great pendulum in the front parlour, which had stood for years with an even, dependable swing, had arrested at our entrance and then resumed with a mannerly apology, as if mindful that its owner's absence must not disturb the order of things. Holmes rose and crossed the room with a long stride which belied his slight figure, standing close to the timepiece and placing his hand upon the case as one might touch a friend in whose stead a confession must be sought. "This clock," he said, "has been handled within the last 2 hours." Mrs. Halcombe started, for the statement seemed to him at once to lay bare a breach in her account, and to name the precise fashion in which it had been wrought. She protested that no one had been in the parlour since the previous evening, yet the lines about her mouth deepened as if she were inhabited by an argument between honesty and protection. I observed, too, that the hearth had been raked more recently than she had suggested. The ash lay in a slight heap that betrayed a hand's recent movement. Holmes's glance, acute as ever, took these facts, not in isolation, but as an assembled sentence. "If the clock was handled," he said quietly, "then the presence of another in this room is certain. Whether that presence was friend or foe remains to be discovered." The widow's lips whitened as she considered this, and then, with a small, almost imperceptible motion, drew the shawl more closely about her shoulders as one who closes a book upon an unwelcome phrase. We spoke then of the apprentice. Samuel Greaves was fetched from his lodgings, pale and trembling, and he arrived with the air of a man who has been awakened to answer a summons at a place one fears to look upon. He described with a boy's honesty the pattern of the master's days, how Joseph would spend long hours adjusting a prototype for a stranger commission, and how, towards the end, he had grown secretive about a certain mechanism which he would not show even to his favoured pupils. When Holmes questioned him about the night of the death, the lad's fingers twitched upon his coat as if the memory were a thing he could not keep within his skin. He confessed that he had seen, in the morning, the master bent over his work with the expression of one who attends to a conversation heard through a wall, listening yet unable to respond. He looked as if he had been listening to someone very far away, Samuel whispered, and the words lodged in the room like a thin, persistent bell. As our inquiries continued, a pattern began to emerge not from sudden revelations, but from a steady accumulation of small certainties. A guest at odd hours, a studied secrecy about a particular device, the increased nervousness of a man who had once found solace in the regularity of gears and teeth. The widow's eyes followed each utterance as if she sought in them confirmation of what she suspected and feared most, that her husband's death had been the product not of chance, but of a careful arrangement. When Holmes rose to take leave, and we once more faced the drizzle on Gilston Lane, I felt the rain upon my face as though it were a clean and impartial witness. Yet even its coolness could not wash away the sense that we had been given a glimpse into a handiwork of human design, minutely executed and morally complex. It is one thing to examine the mechanics of a clock, and quite another to measure the mechanics of a man's sorrow. As we walked back to Baker Street, the lamps along the road threw up small pools of light which the rain made tremble, and I reflected that in a case such as this the instruments and the emotions were inextricable. The same meticulousness that produced the finest watch could serve, in another hand, to manufacture mischief. I knew with the uneasy certainty of a physician diagnosing a malaise that our task would be to untangle an exact pattern from the fabric of grief, and that in so doing we must treat both with the greatest care. The widow's house receded behind us, its clocks singing their small, obstinate music, and I felt that we had left, in that room, something fragile and not yet resolute, a sorrow that required, as much as a verdict, compassion. In every investigation there comes a moment when the ordinary rhythm of a life refuses to align with the facts of its ending, and it is in that dissonance that the true shape of a mystery begins to reveal itself. So it was with Joseph Halcombe. The hours that preceded his death lay before us like a watch dismantled and scattered across a bench, all the pieces present in form, yet the arrangement so confounding that no mechanism would run. I confess that as Holmes and I retraced the final steps of the man's last day, an unease settled upon me unlike any I had previously known, for it seemed we were contending less with deception than with an absence deliberately made. We were not being lied to, we were being evaded by the truth itself. Holmes began the morning with a kind of concentrated silence that presaged labor of the most intense variety. He paced the length of our rooms with his hands clasped behind him, his head inclined at the angle of a man reading a book written across the floorboards. Every few minutes he would pause, stand quite still, and then resume with a renewed quickness as if a thought had presented itself only to withdraw before he could grasp it. I knew those signs well. They marked a problem whose solution lingered just beyond the edge of perception. He had slept scarcely 2 hours, yet there was no evidence of fatigue. Some minds draw vigor from rest. His drew it from conflict. When at last he spoke, it was in a tone low and even. The widow's narrative, though sincere, contains omissions that are not of her own making, he said. Her husband concealed something from her, not a betrayal of the heart, but a betrayal of the craft. There is a difference, Watson, and it matters. He stopped before the mantel and touched the cracked watch we had taken from the workshop, running his finger along the fissure in the crystal, as though feeling the break might tell him when it occurred. This fracture did not happen in a fall. It happened while the watch was in the hand. A hand steady enough to do work, but moved, violently or abruptly, by some influence from without. That suggests intrusion. Or shock, I offered. He allowed the thought to hang a moment. Possibly, but shock leaves a signature upon the body as well as upon an instrument, and the widow Halcombe has described none. Before we left Baker Street, he examined once more the telegram, which he had taken to carrying with him like a talisman. He slipped it inside his pocketbook with an expression of such gravity that I understood it had ceased to be merely a summons. It was now a key to a larger sequence of events, and Holmes meant to fit it into the lock. We took a hansom to Gilston Lane under skies the colour of tarnished pewter, the air thick with a damp that settled upon the skin like cold breath. Holmes scarcely spoke during the drive, yet his silence did not trouble me. It was the silence of a man constructing a delicate structure in his thoughts, and any conversation, however casual, might have disturbed its balance. Upon our arrival, we found Samuel Greaves waiting anxiously at the gate. His youthful face had grown paler still, as though the night had drained from him what colour grief had left. He informed us, in hurried tones, that he had remembered something of importance, or rather, something he had not previously understood to be important. It concerned the clockmaker's movements on the night before his death. He left the workshop very late, the boy said, long after the lamps in the street were out. He told me he needed air, but he took with him a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He held it very tight, sir, almost as if he feared someone might take it from him. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Did he say where he was going? No, sir. Only that I was not to wait up for him. And did he return? Yes, Mr. Holmes, but not until nearly dawn. His coat was damp as though he had walked far in the wet. He went straight to the parlour and locked the door. I heard him wind one of the large clocks within. After some time he emerged, pale and breathing sharply, and sent me home. He would not let me look inside. This testimony, slight though it seemed, struck Holmes with the force of revelation. He thanked the boy and strode directly toward the house, his steps quick and sure. I followed with a growing conviction that the missing hours between midnight and sunrise held the crux of the case. Inside the workshop, the air felt heavier than the day before, as though the room had absorbed something of the widow's dread. Holmes surveyed the benches, the tools, the dust, the patterns of displacement. Nothing had changed, yet something had. Watson, he said, observe the shelf by the window. The dust has been disturbed in a narrow strip, not wide enough for a man's hand, but just enough for a small parcel. It rested here recently. But the widow denied any such object, I said. She spoke truthfully. She did not see it. He removed it before she entered. Holmes crossed to the tall clock in the parlour and opened the case. The pendulum swung in its steady arc, serene as a priest delivering a timeless sermon. He wound this clock at dawn, not as routine but with purpose. He leaned closer. It is running half a second slow. That in itself is not remarkable. What is remarkable is that it was deliberately set so. For what purpose? I asked. He did not answer, for at that moment the widow entered, her face drawn, but her bearing resolute. She thanked us for returning, though the tremor in her voice suggested she feared the very results she sought. Holmes regarded her with a gentleness I had seldom seen him employ. Madame, forgive my directness, but did your husband have enemies? No, she said. Or rather, none who would have wished him harm. He was a man of careful dealings. Did he receive visitors who made him uneasy? She hesitated. That hesitation was more revealing than any words she might have spoken. Her fingers knotted around the edge of her shawl. There was one, she said finally. A gentleman who came 3 times. Well-dressed, soft-spoken. He brought a pocket watch for repair, but her voice faltered. Joseph said the mechanism within was not honest. I did not understand him. Holmes's eyes glinted. Not honest? So he said, as though it were meant to do something, besides keep time. The phrase seemed to strike Holmes like a blow. He turned away sharply, pacing once in a tight line before the mantel. I saw the spark in his expression, the faint flare of triumph mixed with unease. Whatever hypothesis he had been forming, this confirmed it. He asked next about the neighbour who had discovered the body, and the widow told us the man's name, Mr. Aldenbury, a retired merchant with a fondness for early walks. Holmes requested to speak with him, and we crossed the narrow lane to a modest brick dwelling flanked by bare winter rose bushes. Mr. Aldenbury received us with a courtesy that masked a certain fretfulness. His account of the morning was straightforward. He had passed the house just after sunrise and seen, through the parlor window, the figure of the clockmaker lying upon the floor. He had alerted Mrs. Halcombe at once. "Did you see any movement within the house before that time?" Holmes asked. "No, sir. Only the lamp burning low, as though someone had sat up late." "And you observed nothing unusual earlier in the night?" Aldenbury hesitated. "Well, there was a sound." Holmes leaned forward. "A sound? A faint one, like a metallic tap, or something brushing against metal." He looked uncertain. "But it could have been a branch in the wind." "There was no wind," Holmes said gently. "Think again." The man swallowed, then nodded reluctantly. "It came from the parlor. I thought I heard the clock being opened." When we left the neighbor's house, Holmes was unusually grave. The clues, though fragmentary, were beginning to cohere into a pattern that suggested neither accident nor ordinary foul play. The cracked watch, the disturbed parcel shelf, the clock set deliberately off time, the late visitor with the dishonest mechanism, these elements pointed towards an intrusion that was both precise and intimate, as though someone had moved through the house not as a thief but as a fellow craftsman. Holmes walked ahead of me, his hands thrust deep into his coat pockets, the collar turned up against the damp. "Watson," he said at last, "we must reconstruct the lost hours of that night. Not from testimony alone, but from the objects themselves. They have been touched by the truth even when the witnesses have not." "And what do you expect to find?" "A conversation," he said, "between two men who understood clocks better than they understood one another." I sensed that the case had already taken hold of his mind with that rare, fevered intensity that marked only the most unusual of our adventures. The missing hours lay before us like a corridor whose door had been left ajar, and Holmes meant to walk it to its end. But even I, accustomed as I was to the shadows of London and the darker turns of human ingenuity, felt a chill when he added softly, "And whichever man left that conversation alive did not leave unobserved." London has its own particular way of absorbing secrets, as if the very bricks of its buildings had acquired over the centuries a talent for swallowing whispers whole. Yet Scotland Yard, grim, upright, and eternally smelling of damp wool and ink, has a personality altogether different. It does not swallow secrets, it mishandles them. It sets them upon desks beneath flickering lamps, misfiles them in drawers already swollen with older enigmas, and scatters them across the consciousness of inspectors who see more tragedy than pattern. Holmes had always regarded it with a kind of irritable fondness, the way a master craftsman might regard a workshop full of earnest but clumsy apprentices. And on the morning of our visit, that fondness was tempered by something sharper, for he sensed, with that instinct that seldom erred, that the Yard had already fumbled vital threads of the Halcombe affair. As we stepped inside, the corridors exhaled the familiar odor of paper dust and damp stone. A constable passed with a stack of ledgers under his arm, his boots leaving a faint trail of mud across the tiles. Holmes ignored him completely. His gaze was fixed ahead, where Inspector Lestrade awaited us with the particular expression he reserved for our visits. That uneasy mixture of irritation and relief which arises when one needs help from a man whose superiority one resents. "Holmes," Lestrade said by way of greeting. "Dr. Watson." His mustache bristled slightly as though the mere sight of us had unsettled his facial hair. "I trust you're here about the man in Gilston Lane. Widow sent a note early this morning asking whether the Yard would reopen the inquiry." Holmes inclined his head. "The inquiry, Inspector, was never opened properly to begin with. What you conducted was a polite glance at the surface, followed by the immediate assumption of natural death." Lestrade stiffened. The man had no marks of violence. Not all violence leaves marks, Holmes replied quietly. Have you examined the tall clock in the Halcombe parlour? Lestrade blinked. A clock? Just so. Lestrade, who prided himself on being immune to intimidation, looked away in faint embarrassment. I cannot say that we deemed the clock relevant. Holmes sighed, the sound long and almost musical in its resignation. Then allow us to examine whatever you did deem relevant. Where are the constable's observations? Lestrade motioned us into a cramped room littered with reports. A lamp sputtered on the desk, casting the shadows of papers like skeletal hands reaching for us. He produced a single sheet. Here, statement from neighbor, statement from widow, report from physician. Nothing contradictory, no suggestion of foul play. Holmes scanned the paper in seconds. The physician is an imbecile. Lestrade bristled. He is a respectable man. He is a respectable imbecile, Holmes corrected. He notes that the expression on the deceased's face suggested distress, and yet he draws no inference from that, preferring instead to write, likely heart failure, a diagnosis which, I note, he arrived at without examining the heart. Lestrade opened his mouth to retort, then closed it again. Holmes continued, tapping the paper. The timeline is incomplete by no less than 5 hours. Your report jumps from apprentice left at 11 to body discovered at dawn. What transpired between those hours? Why was no search made for witnesses on the adjoining lanes? Why does the report contain not one observation regarding the workshop, the tools, or the condition of the tall clock? Lestrade's irritation gave way to a reluctant frown. The case did not appear unusual. Inspector, Holmes said with quiet emphasis, in my experience, it is precisely the cases that do not appear unusual which demand the greatest scrutiny. I watched the exchange with a growing sense that Holmes was treading upon a delicate line. He had need of Lestrade's cooperation, but too sharp a rebuke might cause the inspector to shut himself like a clam. Fortunately, Lestrade, for all his limitations, knew Holmes's tone well enough to recognize that irritation was seldom vindictive. It was tactical. We did find something odd, Lestrade said at last, grudgingly. He crossed to a drawer, rummaged through its clutter, and produced an object wrapped in cloth. He unfolded it carefully. Within lay a small brass component, thin, round, dented in one place, and bearing a faint smear of dark oil. Holmes seized it like a hawk plucking prey. Where was this recovered? Near the workshop door, on the floor. Why was I not told? You were not involved, Lestrade said, but the apology in his tone softened the rebuke. Holmes examined the piece with intense concentration. Not from Halcombe's clocks. The threading is wrong, machined too finely. And look here, an impression where a pin once rested. Watson, this is not the work of the deceased. Lestrade shifted uneasily. What do you think it is? A component, Holmes murmured, from a pocket instrument, but one designed with a sophistication beyond the typical commercial watch. Something bespoke. I recognized the look in Holmes's eyes, the spark of intuition. But he did not elaborate. He rarely did until his reasoning achieved full shape in his mind. Lestrade cleared his throat. There is one more matter. Minor, perhaps. One of the constables reported seeing a stranger in Gilston Lane the night before the body was found. Tall man, dark coat, walking with purpose. Time? Holmes asked. Shortly after midnight. Holmes's gaze sharpened. And this was not included in the report. The constable said he hadn't thought it relevant. Men walk through London at all hours. Holmes closed his eyes briefly. Inspector, had your man seen the Angel Gabriel descending, he would have marked it down as a bird of unusual plumage. Lestrade winced. We can circulate a description. It would be pointless, Holmes said. We have too little to go on. He wrapped the brass component in a handkerchief and slipped it into his pocket. But this is something. He folded the report, returned it to the desk, and motioned me to follow. Lestrade hurried after us. "You think the man was murdered?" Lestrade said. "I think," Holmes replied, "that you have been handed the outer casing of a mystery. The mechanism within remains concealed, but there are gears, Inspector. There are always gears." Lestrade looked as though he would ask more, but Holmes, with a wave of his hand, dismissed the question. We left Scotland Yard and stepped back onto the street, where the steady drizzle had eased into a fine mist. London's omnipresent traffic murmured in the distance, the great engines of the city beating with a rhythm that felt, at that moment, uncomfortably similar to the interior of a clock. Holmes walked briskly. "Watson, the Yard has overlooked 3 crucial details." "Only 3?" I said lightly. Holmes smiled faintly. 3 that matter at present. First, the component is bespoke, crafted with a precision that suggests a maker of high skill. Second, the tall clock in the Halcombe parlour was adjusted at dawn, long after the deceased had died. Third, a stranger walked Gilston Lane at midnight with deliberate intent. "And how do these facts converge?" I asked. "They converge," Holmes said, "upon the missing hours." We continued along the pavement. Holmes's gaze drifted upward, not in thought, but in something closer to vigilance. I followed his eyes, but saw only the grey sky and the last wisps of morning mist. "There is a pattern," he continued softly. "A pattern hidden by caution. A cautious craftsman, a cautious intruder, a cautious instrument." "And the widow?" I asked. Holmes's eyes softened, but only briefly. "She is cautious out of fear, but her fear is genuine. She does not conceal malice." "And the apprentice?" "He conceals guilt," Holmes replied, "but not the kind that interests me." We walked on in silence for several minutes. Holmes studied the buildings, the pavement, the direction of carriages, as though each were communicating some subtle, encoded truth. I knew that look. He was reconstructing the night, movement by movement, sound by sound. Finally he spoke. "Watson, what do you make of a clockmaker who leaves his house at midnight, returns at dawn with a parcel, locks himself in a room, adjusts a clock, and dies with fear in his eyes?" I considered my answer carefully. I should say he had met with someone who frightened him, someone who threatened him, or someone who demanded something he could no longer refuse. Holmes nodded. "Yes, but there is more. Look beyond the drama of human motive. Think mechanically." Mechanically, he stopped walking and turned to me. "The clock was half a second slow, Watson. Half a second, not 1, not 2. Precisely half. That is not chance. That is communication." "Communication?" "A signal," Holmes murmured, "left for someone who would know how to read it." A shiver passed through me. "And who," I asked quietly, "was meant to receive that signal?" Holmes began walking again, his stride lengthening. "We must find out," he said, "before the one who was meant to receive it decides to silence the message entirely." Samuel Greaves awaited us the following morning with the air of one who has passed through a night not of sleep but of silent torment, and who expects, with each new hour, to be summoned to face something half imagined and half dreaded. He stood in the doorway of the clockmaker's workshop like a figure caught between boyhood and manhood, thin, earnest, trembling at the edges. And the more I observed him, the more I understood that whatever secrets he carried were not born of guilt, but of fear. Fear, in the young, takes on a particular shape. Not the hardness one sees in seasoned criminals, but a kind of nervous translucence, as though the truth were visible through them, struggling to surface. Holmes regarded him with that peculiar mixture of gentleness and scrutiny he reserved for the shy or half-frightened. "Mr. Greaves," he said in a quiet tone that offered no threat, "you must understand that nothing you say can worsen your position, but much may improve it. Clarity is our best ally." The boy's eyes flicked toward the tall parlor clock, which loomed in its corner like a mute witness, then back to the workbench where the deceased had spent his final hours. "I want to help, sir," he murmured, "but I do not know what I saw or what it meant." Holmes seated himself upon a high stool, folded his long fingers, and waited. The silence drew the boy out more effectively than any interrogation could have done. "I came early, the morning he was found," Samuel began haltingly. "Earlier than usual. I had a feeling, I cannot explain it. He had sent me home at dawn, but I felt I should return." His voice wavered on the last word. "When I entered the workshop, everything was as it is now, except for the sound." Holmes tilted his head. "The sound?" "Yes, sir. The tall clock. It was ticking wrong." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Wrong how?" The boy swallowed. "It was too slow. Not just a little. Enough that even I could hear it." Master Halcombe hated imprecision. He said a slow clock is a liar. "And was he in the parlor?" "No, sir." Samuel looked down, twisting his cap in his hands. "He was lying on the floor. I thought at first he had fainted. I called his name. He did not stir. Then I ran for the neighbor." The memory threatened to overwhelm him, and his voice thinned to a whisper. Holmes allowed him a moment, then asked, in the gentlest tone I'd ever heard from him, "Did your master ever set a clock deliberately wrong?" Samuel's head jerked up. "Never. He would rather break it than set it wrong." "And yet he set this one slow." The boy paled. "But why?" "Because he wanted someone to know something," Holmes replied. "Someone who could recognize the meaning." Samuel blinked. "Meaning?" Holmes rose and crossed to the workbench. The room was heavy with the smell of oil and metal shavings. He lifted a small box of tools, a precision set of fine screwdrivers and tweezers, and examined them one by one. "Tell me, Samuel, what work was your master doing the day before he died?" The boy hesitated, and in that hesitation Holmes detected more than evasion. He detected conflict. "Well?" Samuel's shoulders slumped. "He was working on something new, a mechanism." "What kind of mechanism?" His face tightened with anxiety. "I don't know exactly. He kept it covered most of the time, even when he worked on it. He said it wasn't ready for anyone to see. But once, when he thought I'd gone, I looked. Just for a moment." Holmes did not admonish the boy. Curiosity in apprentices is rarely malicious. "What did you see?" Holmes asked. Samuel drew a shaky breath. "A small frame. Brass. Wires. Springs. But not for a watch. It was too delicate for that. Too intricate." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Delicate how?" "The springs were arranged oddly," the boy said. "Not to measure time. More like—" he struggled for the words. "More like to react. To movement or sound." A hush fell upon the room. Holmes stepped closer, his interest sharpened to a keen edge. "React to sound?" "That's what it looked like," Samuel whispered. "There were little reeds, like in a music box, but cut much finer, thin as hair." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. The rumor whispered in the Strand, the dishonest mechanism brought by the mysterious gentleman, the widow's unease. All of it began to align with Samuel's frightened confession. "And what became of this mechanism?" Holmes asked softly. Samuel shook his head. "I don't know. The night before he died, Master Halcombe removed it from the workshop. He wrapped it in brown paper. The parcel I told you about, he held it close, like something precious. Or dangerous." Holmes paced the length of the room once before turning abruptly. "Samuel, when you found him the next morning, was the parcel here?" The boy looked bewildered. "No, sir." "And has anyone else seen it since?" "No. I asked Mrs. Halcombe. She said she had no knowledge of it." Holmes's expression became taut. "Then it is missing." A silence fell thick upon the workshop. Outside in the lane, a cart creaked past, the wheels splashing through shallow puddles. The ordinary sound contrasted sharply with the tension inside, where Samuel Greaves trembled like a witness to a ghost. Holmes moved to the tall clock once more, opening the case with a decisive click. He placed his ear close to the pendulum and listened. I watched him with that uneasy fascination which always overtook me at such moments, when his entire being became little more than a set of senses tuned to impossible precision. "Watson," he murmured, "note the tension of this spring. It is slightly overstressed. Someone wound it too tightly during the adjustment." I bent close. He was correct. The strain upon the coil spoke of nervous fingers. "Not the widow," Holmes added. "Her hands tremble, but not with that kind of pressure, and Samuel, though earnest, lacks the confidence to handle a clock of this craftsmanship unauthorized." He let the clock's door swing shut. "Someone else entered this house," he said, "either before the clockmaker's death or just after." Samuel's voice, thin now with dread, broke the silence. "But, sir, how? The door was locked." Holmes fixed him with a steady gaze. "Locks keep out the unskilled, not those who understand mechanisms." As we left the workshop for the lane, Holmes led the way with that long, purposeful stride, which meant he had reached the threshold of some crucial realization. I followed closely, Samuel trailing behind like a nervous shadow. "Holmes," I said quietly when we were out of earshot, "do you believe the boy conceals more?" "No," he said simply. "But he knows more than he understands. That is often more dangerous." We reached the corner where Gilston Lane bent sharply toward the river. Holmes stopped there, his eyes sweeping the street with the intensity of a man searching not for people, but for imprints, disturbances, traces invisible to others. "Watson," he said, "recall the component from Scotland Yard. Brass, finely threaded, out of place in Halcombe's workshop." "Yes. It did not come from the mechanism Samuel described, but it belongs to its family." "You mean another piece of the same invention," Holmes finished, "or of a copy?" A chill passed through me. "A copy." Holmes's voice dropped. "There are men who would kill to acquire a mechanism capable of reacting to sound. Think, Watson, a device that listens, that records not time but movement, perhaps even speech." I caught my breath. "You believe the clockmaker was creating such a device?" Holmes's silence was answer enough. We walked on toward Baker Street, the rain light but insistent now, tapping upon Holmes's hat brim like the finger of some invisible conductor beating time. After several minutes he spoke again. "The missing hours," he said, "are not missing because no one witnessed them. They are missing because someone ensured that every witness, every object, every clock, every trace was altered, removed, or silenced." "And the apprentice?" I asked. Holmes's gaze softened faintly at the thought of the boy. "He is a footnote, but the man who visited Halcombe 3 times, the man with the dishonest mechanism, he is the one we must find." "And if we do?" I asked. Holmes stopped walking. He looked up the street where the lamps flickered in the damp and the city moved with its habitual indifference. "If we do," he said quietly, "we will discover what was taken from that house, and why a man who understood time so perfectly used his final hour to set a clock half a second slow." He resumed walking, his silhouette cutting sharply through the mist. "The apprentice," he added, almost to himself, "is afraid of the wrong threat. It is not the dead man he fears. It is the one who entered the house unseen and may yet return. London alters its face according to one's purpose in walking it. To the idle stroller, it is a city of spectacles. To the desperate, a labyrinth of escape routes. To the criminal, a vast cloak woven of alleyways and unlit doorways. But to Sherlock Holmes, keen-eyed, tireless, uncompromising, it is a living diagram whose lines shift, tilt, and converge according to the movements of men. And on the evening we traced the next thread of the Halcombe affair, the city revealed a darker contour than any I had lately seen. For the path led not through the comfortable quarters of craftsmen and widows, but into that uneasy region of the Strand where privacy is bought cheaply and secrets are exchanged for the price of a whispered name. Holmes announced our destination without preamble. "The Strand," he said as we stepped from the hansom near Charing Cross, "but not the stretch known to the theatre-going public. We are bound for the back rooms. The rooms where idle collectors, eccentric scholars, and men of questionable trade gather to barter curiosities they cannot afford to display in daylight." A faint drizzle had begun to fall, smearing the reflections of the shop lamps across the pavement like the strokes of an impatient brush. I kept close beside him as he led us into narrower passages branching from the main thoroughfare. Here the air changed. The noise of the city softened. The smells grew sharper: ink, tobacco, machinery, oil, and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. People watched us not with curiosity, but with the furtive appraisal of those who measure strangers according to potential threat. Holmes stopped before a shop whose signboard displayed no name, only the faded outline of a lyre. The windows were darkened behind thick curtains. A bell tinkled faintly as we entered. The interior smelled of dust, amber resin, and damp paper. Shelves leaned wearily beneath the weight of peculiar devices: old telescopes, rusted navigational tools, discarded cogs, and instruments whose original purpose had been lost to time. The proprietor was a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, his hair sticking up like a frightened hedgehog. He greeted Holmes with a mixture of surprise and guarded irritation. "You again," he muttered. "I told you the last time, I deal only in legitimate curiosities." Holmes smiled pleasantly. "My dear Mr. Penfield, if ever I discover you dealing in anything legitimate, I shall take it as a sign of your declining health. But I assure you, we are here for information only." Penfield made a noise somewhere between a scoff and a groan. "Information costs." Holmes placed a half-crown on the counter. "This is for listening. More may follow if your listening proves worthy." The man's fingers closed around the silver with surprising speed. "Well?" Holmes withdrew from his pocket the brass component recovered from Scotland Yard and laid it on the counter between them. Penfield adjusted his spectacles, squinted, then frowned deeply. "No," he said at once. "I do not like it." Holmes's voice turned silk soft. "Precisely why I have brought it to you. What do you see?" "A mechanism too finely cut for commercial work," Penfield replied. "Too delicate for military, too small for music, and this," he pointed at the faint impression of a pin groove, "suggests a tension spring designed to release silently." Holmes and I exchanged a look. "Who," Holmes asked quietly, "would commission such a thing?" Penfield's answer came as a mutter: "Men who value listening more than talking." Holmes leaned closer. "Do you know which men?" Penfield hesitated, casting a nervous glance toward the curtain at the back of the shop. "I hear things," he said. "People in my line always do. There's talk of a gentleman, always well-dressed, soft voice, no name given, who buys discarded clockworks, wants the parts that can be altered, asks for them to be reshaped, rethreaded. He pays too well and too quietly for honest work." The widow of Gilston Lane described such a man. Holmes murmured. 3 visits. Penfield's fingers twitched. "Then your clockmaker got involved in something he should have left alone." Holmes's voice sharpened. "Did this man acquire components for a device that reacts to sound?" Penfield swallowed but nodded. "I believe so. I warned him. The last craftsman who dealt with him disappeared for a month." Holmes stiffened. "Disappeared?" "Yes, sir. And returned pale, thin, speaking little. Closed his shop soon after. Went to live with a cousin in Birmingham. Before he left, he told me—" Penfield hesitated again. "He told me the man wanted a mechanism that could be concealed. Something portable, something that would respond to whispered voices. A mechanism that listens. Holmes's reaction was swift, though he kept his expression composed. "And this gentleman," he said softly. "Where might we find him?" Penfield gave a hollow laugh. "Find him? Mr. Holmes, the man finds you." For several moments, Holmes stood perfectly still, as though the air around him had turned to glass, and he feared a single movement might crack it. Then, with quiet deliberation, he picked up the brass piece and slipped it into his pocket. "You have been very helpful, Mr. Penfield," he said. "Should anyone inquire after us, forget we were here." Penfield nodded vigorously. "Gladly." Outside, the drizzle had intensified, turning the narrow street into a ribbon of muted reflections. Holmes walked in silence, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, his head bowed slightly, not in defeat, but in concentration so fierce I dared not interrupt. At last he spoke. "Watson, we are approaching the heart of the matter. Halcombe was coerced into constructing a mechanism, not a watch, not a clock, a listening device, something subtle, something portable, and he realized, too late, the nature of the men who wanted it. And he tried to hide it," I said. "He tried to hide part of it," Holmes replied, "but the rest was already in their hands. They returned for the remainder at dawn." A shiver passed through me. "And what then?" Holmes's voice dropped as we passed into a darker lane. "Then Watson, he left a message, a final message, contained in the only language he trusted. The clock? Exactly. He could not speak it aloud, for he was already under threat. But he adjusted the tall clock half a second slow. A code, a warning, a betrayal of time intended to expose the betrayal he had endured. We walked beneath a gas lamp, its halo sputtering against the damp. The shadows of passing figures seemed to lengthen and merge, like ink spilled upon wet paper. Holmes halted so abruptly I almost collided with him. "Watson," he said, "someone is following us." I looked over my shoulder, but the street seemed nearly empty, save for a lone figure far behind, face obscured beneath a bowler hat. "Do not turn again," Holmes said softly. "He is observing, not approaching. That means one of two things. Either he already knows who we are, or he is waiting to confirm it." A chill crept along my spine. "What do we do?" "We continue walking," Holmes said calmly, "and we allow him to decide whether to confront us. If he flees, we follow. If he approaches, we engage. But we must give him the choice that reveals his intent." We resumed our pace. The mysterious figure paused at a corner as though uncertain whether to retreat or pursue. Holmes's gaze flickered once in his direction, no more. Then, as if the city itself drew a breath, the man turned sharply and vanished into a side passage. Holmes let out a slow exhale. He will not confront us. Not yet. His masters will want more information first. They will follow. They will listen. They will hope we lead them to what they seek. "The missing mechanism," I said. Holmes's tone grew somber. "And the one who knows where it is." "Mrs. Halcombe?" Holmes shook his head. "No, she knows nothing." He paused. "But the apprentice may know something he did not realize he knew." "And the men pursuing us?" I asked quietly. Holmes stepped into the street, the lamplight falling like a thin corona around him. "They will not hesitate to silence anyone who stands between them and that device," he said. "Which means that as of tonight, Watson," his gaze swept the shadowed street, "we stand squarely in their way. There are moments in an investigation when the air itself seems to thicken with consequence, when each word spoken and each sound overheard seems somehow heavier than before, as if weighted with the pressure of unseen eyes. The night after our encounter in the Strand carried precisely this sensation. I felt it in the tilt of the gas lamps outside Baker Street, in the hush of the stairwell as we ascended, and most acutely in Holmes himself, whose every movement bore a taut precision, as though he were listening not only with his ears, but with the full tension of his nerves. He shut the door behind us and remained standing for a long moment, his silhouette illuminated by the faint halo of lamplight from the street. "Watson," he said at last, "we are no longer merely observers. The men seeking Halcombe's invention have taken note of us. They will now proceed with caution, and so must we." I removed my gloves with a stiffness that betrayed the unease settling over me. "Do you believe they intend violence?" Holmes gave a faint, humorless smile. "I believe they intend acquisition. Violence is simply one method of achieving it. But their preference, for now, is discretion. They are listening first, planning, plotting the lines along which we move." He strode to the mantel and lit the fire with a single striking gesture. The flames flared up, casting a warm but restless glow across the room. The cracked watch lay on the table where he had placed it that morning, its broken face gleaming like an eye half shut. Holmes picked it up and turned it over in his hands. "This device," he murmured, "was the first casualty in the Clockmaker's war, though he never named it as such." "It is an ordinary watch," I said. "No, Watson, it was an ordinary watch." He tapped the cracked crystal lightly, until it became something else, something that frightened its maker enough to hide it at the first opportunity. I stepped closer. "You believe this watch was altered?" "I do." He pointed to the fine inner scoring. "The grooves are not the work of time alone. They were modified. A pin once rested here, thin, delicate, almost invisible, a fragment of the larger device Halcombe was compelled to construct." A silence grew between us, punctuated only by the popping of the fire. The events of the day replayed in my mind like scenes from a dream that had turned darker with each passing hour. The brass component recovered at the yard, Penfield's trembling recognition, the shadow that had followed us through the narrow streets. It felt as though we had wandered unknowingly into the middle of an elaborate choreography, one in which the next movement had been prepared long before we had taken our first step. Holmes placed the watch down and turned toward the window, drawing aside the curtain just a fraction. He watched the street for several seconds, then let the cloth fall back into place. "They will not approach tonight," he said. "But they will watch, and they will wait. Men driven by silence do not strike without purpose." He walked to his desk, opened a drawer with firm fingers, and retrieved a stack of clippings, scraps from various newspapers, some yellowed, some fresh. He laid them out one by one, forming a scattered map across the table. "What are these?" I asked. "Rumors," Holmes said. "Fragments, whispers carried through London over the past year." He read aloud. "Unusual request made to scientific instrument maker. Anonymous patron seeks covert mechanical device. Clockmaker in Kent disappears after visit from unnamed gentleman. Foreign agents observed near Greenwich workshops." I blinked. These could refer to anything. Holmes looked at me with a sharpness that made me feel as if my words had been a test, and that I had barely passed. "Not anything, Watson. They refer to a pattern of acquisition. Men of obscure allegiance searching for craftsmen capable of building a mechanism precise enough to listen without detection." "A listening machine," I murmured. "Something that records conversation." Holmes's gaze grew distant, as though he were staring at a horizon only he could see. "Not records. Responds. Reacts to sound. Sensitive enough to tremble at a whisper. A device that could be hidden in a room or upon a man's person. A device that would allow eavesdropping of the most intimate nature." "And Halcombe built such a thing?" Holmes shook his head. "No. Halcombe built part of it, and perhaps he tried to destroy the rest." The idea settled upon me with a weight I could not immediately bear. A device capable of such intrusion would be a violation of the most sacred human boundary, the boundary of unobserved thought. I could see why it might tempt governments, criminals, and spies alike. And yet, Holmes continued, there is something more. Something Penfield did not know, and the Yard did not perceive. What is that? Holmes tapped the broken watch once more. The device required not only skill, but secrecy. Halcombe worked in silence because silence was demanded. Silence was enforced. The word silence hung in the room like a spectre. The silence of a clock deliberately altered. The silence of a parcel removed. The silence of a dead man whose expression revealed terror more eloquently than any cry. Holmes, I said quietly, you speak as though he were threatened. He was threatened, Holmes said, his voice dropping into a deeper register. Not by violence alone, by disappearance, by erasure. The men who wanted his invention have removed craftsmen before. Penfield all but confirmed it. And do you believe they will remove us? I asked, attempting lightness I did not feel. If we impede them, Holmes said, they will attempt whatever measures they deem necessary. He delivered the statement in a tone so calm, so untroubled, that I felt a greater chill than if he had shouted it. For Holmes never exaggerated danger. He simply acknowledged it, then stepped toward it. A knock sounded at the door. Not loud, not hurried. A gentle, rhythmic tap. Holmes's head snapped toward the sound. That, he whispered, is not Mrs. Hudson. He motioned me behind the doorframe. I obeyed instinctively, my hand going to the small revolver I carried on rare and necessary occasions. Holmes opened the door a fraction. A boy stood there, no more than 11, shivering slightly in the night air. His cap was soaked, his boots scuffed, and his expression was that of someone who had repeated a sentence to himself many times. "Is this the home of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, sir?" he asked. "It is." The boy swallowed. "I was told to bring you this." He held out a folded scrap of paper. Holmes took it carefully, his fingers barely brushing the child's. "By whom?" "A gentleman, sir. Well-dressed. Soft voice. He said to give it to you and go straight home." Holmes's eyes flickered. The description was unmistakable. "You've done well," Holmes said, offering the boy a coin. "Go safely." The child darted down the stairs and vanished. Holmes closed the door behind him and unfolded the note. His expression did not change, but the firelight revealed a slight tightening at the corner of his mouth. "What does it say?" I asked. He handed it to me without a word. I read, "Time betrays those who tamper with it. Leave the widow's affairs. You walk in rooms where silence is sworn, and silence does not forgive." There was no signature. I lowered the note slowly. A threat. A warning, Holmes corrected, but in the language of those who believe themselves beyond consequence. He turned toward the fire, the flames casting restless shadows across his face. "Watson," he said softly, "the rumor of the silent mechanism is no rumor. It exists, and its creators will stop at nothing to reclaim it." He picked up the cracked watch again, turning it so the broken face caught the flicker of flame. "And now," he added, "they believe we stand between them and the last piece of their design." He let the watch rest in his palm as though listening to its silence. "They are wrong," he murmured. "We do not stand between them." He raised his eyes, alight with the first glimmer of certainty. "We are already ahead of them." Morning returned to Gilston Lane with a pallor that seemed borrowed from the widow herself. The sky hung low and colourless, a vast sheet of dull parchment waiting to be inked with the day's uncertainties. Holmes and I arrived shortly after 8, summoned not by telegram nor policeman, but by Holmes's own unrelenting instinct that something within the house had remained unspoken. Mrs. Halcombe greeted us at the door with that strained composure she had worn since our first meeting, but today there was a different tremor beneath it, a faint, restless heat like a coal buried under ash. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice pitched slightly above its usual tone. "There is something I must show you." Her eyes flickered to me, uncertain, but Holmes inclined his head with a quiet reassurance that seemed to steady her. We followed her into the narrow parlor, where the tall clock stood with its steady, solemn breathing. The pendulum swung with that half-second softness we had come to recognize as the deceased's final message. Outside, a milkman's cart rattled over the stones, but inside the house, time seemed to move at a pace decided only by the widow's courage. She led us to a small writing desk in the corner, an austere piece of furniture with drawers that had clearly been opened many times in recent days. Upon its polished surface lay a single brass key, old and lightly tarnished. "This," she said, "belonged to my husband. He never let it out of his sight. Last night, after you left, I felt a sudden need to open the drawer he always kept locked. I cannot say why." Holmes studied her closely. "Intuition," he said gently, "is often the voice of reason speaking from beneath the surface." She seemed to take comfort in this and unlocked the drawer with a small click that sounded unnervingly loud in the still room. From within, she withdrew a slim, cloth-bound book, a manuscript, its edges worn, its pages slightly yellowed. She held it to her chest for a moment, as though she feared the very air might bruise it. "This is his private diary," she whispered. "I never knew it existed." Holmes accepted the book with reverence, turning it over slowly. "Did you read it?" "Only the beginning. I stopped when I saw what he wrote." Her hands clasped tightly around one another, the knuckles paling. Holmes opened the book and began to read in silence. I watched his eyes move across the lines with an intensity that sharpened with each page. He turned one leaf, then another, pausing only when a phrase demanded deeper contemplation. After several minutes, he spoke. "Watson," he said without looking up, "listen." He read aloud. "There is a visitor who comes to me at dusk. He brings a pocket watch each time, but it is not the watch he wants repaired. It is the mechanism within, the part I am too afraid to refuse and too frightened to complete." Holmes closed the book momentarily and looked at the widow. "This visitor," he said, "was not a client." Mrs. Halcombe nodded. "I suspected as much. Joseph changed after those visits. He grew pale and quick to listen at windows." Holmes continued reading. "He tells me the mechanism will aid the nation, that it will save lives. But the shadows behind him speak of no such noble cause. They whisper of secrets gathered, of silence extracted. I have made a mistake in agreeing to his first request. Now he returns for more. He brings others. They stand outside my window at night. I hear them breathe. A chill passed through the room. The ticking of the tall clock seemed now like the measured heartbeat of an unseen creature. Holmes turned another page. Tonight I completed the delicate reeds. They tremble at the slightest whisper. He was pleased. Too pleased, he asked for the next component. I told him no. I told him the device was too dangerous, that a man ought not to hear what is not meant for him. He smiled. I did not like that smile. Holmes's voice darkened as he reached the next entry. "I must hide the mechanism, not destroy it yet. There is a place where I once kept old commissions. If I place it there, behind the false panel, perhaps they will not think to search for it." He stopped reading. "Where is this place?" I asked quickly. "A false panel. In the house." Mrs. Halcombe looked bewildered. "I know of no such place, Dr. Watson. If he had one, he never shared it with me." Holmes turned the page. His eyes swept the lines, then widened almost imperceptibly. "Ah," he murmured. "Here." He read, "If anything befalls me, let Watson or Holmes read these words. The panel lies behind the third drawer of my workshop cabinet. Only the long brass key will open it." Mrs. Halcombe gasped. "I never saw him use any other key in this house. But perhaps, yes, perhaps in his workshop." Holmes closed the manuscript. "He meant these pages to find us," he said, "and in the event of his death, he wished us to act." "Then we must go," I said. Holmes nodded. "At once." The widow insisted on accompanying us, though fear flickered behind her determination. Her grief had become an instrument of courage, sharper than any steel in the workshop. We entered the workroom where the air still carried the scent of machinery and old oil, as though the clockmaker's breath lingered among the gears. Holmes moved with purpose toward the tall cabinet against the wall, its drawers neatly labeled by type and size of component. "The third drawer," I said. Holmes pulled it open, revealing a collection of springs, pins, screws, and brass wheels arranged with meticulous care. He removed each section with the precision of a surgeon restoring order to a wounded organ. When the drawer lay empty, he tapped its back panel, then the bottom. "Do you hear that?" he asked softly. I listened. A faint hollowness answered, a delicacy in the wood grain, an echo that suggested a void beyond. Holmes took the long brass key the widow had retrieved and slid it along the interior seam. With a soft click, the panel shifted. The widow inhaled sharply. Holmes pulled the panel open. Within lay a small velvet-lined recess, and in it, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple twine, was the missing mechanism. I felt the thrill of discovery mixed with the dread of what lay inside. Holmes lifted it gently, as though it were an infant or a bomb. He placed it on the bench and unwrapped the paper with exquisite care. The device revealed was unlike anything I had seen, a lattice of fine brass rods, delicate springs, and slender metal reeds positioned like the strings of a harp crafted by a jeweler. Holmes's voice was barely more than breath. A silent mechanism, sensitive to vibration, capable of detecting sound without producing any in return. "To what end?" the widow whispered. "To listen," Holmes said. "To overhear. To record movement in air rather than time." He leaned closer. "This is only the first half." The widow recoiled instinctively. "Men killed my husband for this. For such a thing." Holmes did not answer immediately. He touched the reeds lightly, so lightly they scarcely moved. Yet one trembled, just perceptibly, as though recognizing the vibration of a distant whisper. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "note how it reacts even to the sound of breath." I leaned closer. Indeed, with each exhale, a cluster of reeds shivered, a delicate, near-invisible dance. "This," Holmes murmured, "would allow a man to stand in a corridor and hear a conversation in the room beyond, or in the room above. Its application is limitless and dangerous." A sudden knock at the front door froze us. Not the timid rap of a neighbor, not the heavy fist of a constable, a firm, measured knock. Holmes's expression sharpened. "They have followed us." Mrs. Halcombe gasped. "But how?" Holmes's voice was low. "Because they know where the clockmaker hid his fears, and they know the one certainty about grief. It returns to the place where it began." Another knock. Louder. "They will not leave," Holmes said. "Not without the mechanism." "We cannot give it to them," I said. "Certainly not," Holmes replied. "But neither can they be allowed to suspect we possess it. Not yet." "What do you propose?" I whispered. Holmes's eyes flashed with sudden resolve. "We proceed as though nothing has been found." "Watson, hide the mechanism. Quickly." "Where?" Holmes pointed. "Behind the inner rim of the tall clock, the pendulum's case. They will not think to look there. Halcombe's final message lies in that clock, and they believe it already deciphered." The knocking continued. Mrs. Halcombe's breath shivered. "Mr. Holmes, are we in danger?" "Yes," Holmes said simply, "but danger shared is danger diminished." I hid the device as instructed. The mechanism nestled perfectly within the curvature of the clock's interior panel, concealed behind the brass rail. Holmes closed the door of the case just as the front door below opened. Mrs. Hudson's startled voice drifting upward. Holmes took position near the workshop entrance, his posture deceptively relaxed. "Watson," he murmured, "prepare yourself. We are about to receive a visitor whose interests lie not in clocks, but in silence." A shadow darkened the threshold, and then a man stepped into the room. Well-dressed, soft-spoken, the very man the widow had feared. The man who entered the workshop did not announce himself, nor did he hurry. He stepped across the threshold with the composed assurance of someone who had already imagined this moment in detail and arrived merely to confirm it. His coat was immaculate, cut from fabric too fine for common commerce. His gloves were pale and unblemished, and when he lifted his hat in a gesture of respect toward Mrs. Halcombe, the motion was executed with such precise civility that it chilled me more than any outright threat could have done. "Mrs. Halcombe," he said in a voice so smooth it scarcely displaced the air, "my deepest condolences. The city has suffered a great loss." His eyes moved then, to Holmes, then to me, and I felt their weight, not intrusive, but calculating. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, an unexpected pleasure." Holmes returned the bow with cool politeness. "I do not believe we have met." "No," the gentleman replied, smiling faintly, "but I have long admired your methods, your capacity to find meaning where others see only clutter, a commendable talent in these unsteady times." Holmes's gaze narrowed, though his expression remained courteous. "Then you must be one of Mr. Halcombe's patrons." "Patron?" The man chuckled softly. "Such a quaint word for such complicated arrangements. Let us say, rather, that I admired his craftsmanship." He spoke the last word with a strange emphasis, a kind of reverence that hinted at obsession. Mrs. Halcombe, gathering herself with remarkable dignity, stepped closer to Holmes. "What do you want, sir? You come into my house with no warning." "Forgive me, madam," he said, inclining his head, "but I fear there has been some misunderstanding regarding your late husband's unfinished work. I hoped, sincerely, to resolve matters amicably before any regrettable assumptions were made." Holmes moved slightly, placing himself between the widow and the stranger. "If you are here on business pertaining to the deceased, it would be best to state your intentions plainly." The man's smile thinned. "Very well. Mr. Halcombe was in possession of a device commissioned for specific purposes of national security. Purposes I am not at liberty to discuss. He regrettably passed before delivering the completed mechanism. I've come to reclaim what is owed. Nothing more." I felt my breath tighten. Every word from his mouth was crafted with diplomatic restraint, yet beneath that veneer lay something far more dangerous. The confidence of a man whose authority was assumed, not granted. Holmes remained still. "If the device you speak of existed," he said evenly, "it no longer appears to be here." The man's eyes sharpened, though his tone did not waver. "Mr. Holmes, I am well aware of your talents. I am equally aware that you have visited this house several times since the clockmaker's death. I must therefore assume you have conducted an inventory." "You assume much," Holmes said calmly. "Only what your reputation warrants," the man replied. He stepped farther into the workshop, letting his gloved fingers trail near but never touching the scattered tools. "Let me speak plainly. The device is dangerous in the wrong hands. I seek only to prevent its misuse." Holmes folded his arms loosely behind his back. "A noble sentiment." "Not sentiment," the man corrected softly. "Policy." The air seemed to constrict around us. Mrs. Halcombe's hands trembled at her sides. I noticed Holmes's left hand drift, almost imperceptibly, toward the tall clock in the corner, but only for a breath, before returning to his side. The stranger followed the movement with quiet interest. "You believe the device is here," Holmes said. "I know it is here." "And yet," Holmes said lightly, "you search with your tongue, not your hands." The man's expression did not change, but the atmosphere in the room did. A tension entered it like an invisible thread pulled taut. "I was hoping," he said slowly, "that the search would not be necessary. It would be so much simpler if Mrs. Halcombe were able to produce it voluntarily." The widow stepped back instinctively. "I have nothing of yours," she whispered. "Oh, but you do," the man murmured. "Or Mr. Holmes has taken it on your behalf." Holmes's voice remained composed. "You presume that because you commissioned something of the deceased, you may claim it after his death. But the law—" "The law," the man interrupted gently, "is not equipped to handle matters such as these." "Convenient," Holmes said. "Pragmatic," the man corrected. "If the mechanism is found in your possession, Mr. Holmes, I cannot vouch for what will follow. Bureaucracies are impatient, men even more so." Holmes began to move then, not abruptly, but with the fluid grace of one shifting from observation into maneuver. He walked past the stranger and stood near the window, his posture deceptively relaxed. "You speak," Holmes said, "as though you represent authority, yet you give no rank, no office, no affiliation." "It is not necessary," the man replied. "Authority need not be named when it is recognized." "I recognize nothing," Holmes said, "except coercion cloaked in fine manners." For the first time, the man's smile faltered. Not entirely, just enough to reveal the steel beneath. "Then let me be candid," he said. "Your involvement jeopardizes matters far beyond this modest home. If you obstruct us, you will regret it." Holmes turned slightly, the lamplight outlining the sharpness of his profile. "I rarely regret the pursuit of truth." "That," the man said softly, "is precisely what makes you a liability." The room felt suddenly smaller, as though its walls had taken a step inward. I tightened my grip on my cane, an instinct rather than a strategy. Holmes spoke again, his tone cool enough to steady the widow's breathing. "If we possessed the mechanism, and I do not confirm that we do, it would be dangerous to hand it to men unwilling to state their purpose." "You misunderstand," the man said, stepping closer. "You are not being asked." Holmes met his gaze unflinchingly. "And you misunderstand. I'm not in the habit of yielding to threats." Silence followed. Not peaceful silence, but the kind strained by the friction of two wills meeting on a narrow bridge. The man tilted his head slightly, regarding Holmes with an air of reluctant admiration. "You truly do not know what you meddle in." Holmes's voice was quiet. "Enlighten me." "I cannot," the man said, "but I can advise you, stop hunting shadows that do not concern you." "Shadows concern me," Holmes said softly, "when they fall across innocent lives." The man inhaled, slowly. Then, without turning his head, he glanced once more at the tall clock. Just a flicker, but enough. Holmes stepped subtly forward, blocking his view. The man's gaze returned to him. "This conversation," he said, "is over." He placed his hat back upon his head with elegant precision. "If you find the mechanism, Mr. Holmes, deliver it to me. For your sake. For the widow's. For the apprentices." He paused at the door. "And for those you hold dear." Holmes's expression did not change, but something within him, something fierce and burning, kindled behind his eyes. The man bowed once more, then stepped into the hall. The front door opened. Closed. Silence followed. A long, breathless silence. Mrs. Halcombe sagged against the workbench, trembling. I moved at once to aid her. Holmes, meanwhile, remained still as the tall clock behind him. Then he drew a long, controlled breath. "Watson," he said quietly. "Yes?" He turned toward me, and the fire in his eyes had become something cold, sharp, and devastatingly clear. "They will return, not for conversation, and not alone." I swallowed hard. Then what must we do? Holmes stepped to the clock, opened its case, and laid his hand upon the hidden mechanism inside. "We protect this," he said. "We protect the innocent, and we bring into the light whatever shadow has claimed the clockmaker's life." He closed the clock's door gently, as though sealing a pact. "The circle," he murmured, "is closing." I've seen fear in many forms. On battlefields where men tremble despite their uniforms, in sick rooms where breaths shorten like shrinking threads, in courtrooms where the condemned stare at doors that will not reopen. But the fear that settled upon the Halcombe household after the stranger's departure was of a quieter, more insidious breed. It did not rush upon us. It seeped. It entered through the cracks of the floorboards, settled upon the silent clocks, and crept into the expressions of those who remained. It was the fear of being watched, not by a passing gaze, but by an intention patient, cold, and unyielding. Holmes remained still for several moments after the front door closed behind our mysterious visitor. His eyes, sharp as cut glass, fixed upon a point in the empty air as though reading the imprint of the man's shadow. Only when the tall clock behind him let out a faint, uneven tick, its pendulum adjusting from the disturbance of footsteps, did Holmes stir. "Watson," he murmured, "fetch Mrs. Halcombe a chair. She must sit." The widow, pale as morning frost, allowed me to guide her to a seat. Her fingers clutched the edge of her shawl so tightly I feared the fabric might tear. She looked not at us, but at the doorway where the man had vanished, as if expecting him to reappear at any moment with that same polite threat folded neatly into his pocket. Holmes crouched before her with surprising gentleness. "Madam," he said softly, "you must trust me. Your husband's death was no accident, and where injustice has walked once, it may return. But you are not alone." She nodded faintly, but her gaze trembled. Holmes continued, "Did your husband ever confide in you, truly confide, the nature of the work this man demanded of him?" Her lips parted, but no words came. I fetched a glass of water. She accepted it with gratitude, but drank only a sip. "I knew," she whispered at last, "that Joseph had taken on something heavy. Something that caused him distress, but he believed warnings would endanger me." Holmes inclined his head. "He was correct, but secrecy has also placed you at risk." She closed her eyes. "And now?" "Now," Holmes said, "the danger extends to us all, which is precisely why we must uncover the truth fully. No more half-glimpses, no more fragments. Everything you know, you must tell us." For a moment she looked ready to refuse, to retreat into the silence her husband had left her. But then something within her stirred, a small, courageous flame fighting through the ash of uncertainty. She drew a long, trembling breath. "There is more," she said. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the brief tightening of his jaw, the subtle shift he made whenever vital information approached. "Tell us," he said. Mrs. Halcombe clasped her hands upon her lap. 2 weeks before Joseph died, he came home later than usual. I found him in the workshop, kneeling over a small device. So small I thought at first it was a toy. But when I stepped closer, he covered it with his sleeve. Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "What did he say?" he asked. "He said it was a request from a gentleman." But there was something in his voice. Something I had never heard from him before, not anger, not fear. Something helpless, almost. Her breath caught. "And then," she continued, "he told me that if anything ever happened to him, I must not, under any circumstances, let the man return. He made me promise." She looked at the door again, shivering. "And now he has come." Holmes nodded. "Yes. But he does not yet know we have found the mechanism. That gives us time." "Time," the widow echoed. "Time for what, Mr. Holmes?" "To understand what your husband built," he said gravely, "and to understand why his last message, the altered clock, was meant for Watson and me, not for the man he feared." I opened the tall clock's case once more, the brass hinges whispering softly. The hidden mechanism rested within its velvet-lined cradle like a sleeping creature delicate enough to crumble under a careless touch. Holmes stood beside me and lifted it with reverent precision. "Observe, Watson," he said. "These reeds here, see how finely they are cut? No ordinary workshop could produce such uniformity. Only a craftsman of exceptional skill. And compelled to use that skill unwillingly," I murmured. "Yes." Holmes turned the mechanism slightly so that the reeds shimmered in the lamplight. "Halcombe built this not out of desire, but out of duress. His diary confirms it." Mrs. Halcombe raised a shaking hand toward the mechanism, but stopped short of touching it. "He worked nights," she said. "He would sit here long after the lamps burned low. When I rose to fetch him to bed, he would startle, as though caught stealing." Holmes nodded. He was stealing from the men who sought this device, delaying them, sabotaging their timeline, and perhaps... He paused, the thought forming with the precision of a gear sliding into place. "Perhaps leaving clues for us?" He turned to the widow. "Is there anything else?" he said. "Even a phrase, a hint, something that made little sense to you at the time?" She pressed her knuckles to her mouth in concentration, then lowered her hand. "There was one thing," she whispered. "The night before he died, he held my hands and said, 'Eliza, time itself must testify.' I did not understand him." Holmes inhaled sharply. "Watson," he said, "do you realize what this means?" I frowned but nodded slowly. "The clock." "Yes," Holmes said. "The tall clock in this room. He set it half a second slow, not merely as a signal, but as a testimony. Time testified to intrusion." Mrs. Halcombe blinked rapidly. "Intrusion?" Holmes turned to her. "Someone entered your home. Someone adjusted this clock. Not your husband. That adjustment, made at dawn, was not his doing. It was theirs." She let out a soft cry, covering her mouth with both hands. Holmes stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Madam, I understand this is difficult, but we must know. Did you hear anything unusual that night? A step? A creak in the hallway? A door?" She thought for a long moment, then gasped. "There was a noise," she said. "Just before dawn, a metallic sound, like something being opened and then closed again, but I thought it was Joseph working." Holmes's eyes flashed. "That was not your husband. It was the intruder adjusting the clock." She trembled violently. I placed a supporting hand on her shoulder. "And the intruder," Holmes added, "was not the man who visited today." She looked up sharply. "How do you know?" "He is too cautious," Holmes said. "Too poised. He would never risk entering alone." "No, someone else came. Someone sent to retrieve the mechanism quietly before their superior intervened." "And they failed?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Because Halcombe hid it too well." The widow, pale and breathless, asked in a whisper, "Then why did they return today?" "To discover what we had found," Holmes said, "and to remind us that their patience has limits." Another silence fell, heavy, oppressive. "Holmes," I said softly, "you mentioned earlier that the mechanism is only half complete." "Yes." "Then where is the other half?" Holmes's eyes traveled slowly across the workshop until they settled on the window, the same window the shadowy visitors had watched from outside. "That," he said, "is what concerns me most. Halcombe may have hidden the second component separately. He may have given it to someone, or..." He paused. "He may have destroyed it." "And if he did?" the widow whispered. Holmes closed the clock's case gently. "Then the men who hunted him will stop at nothing to learn its fate." We fell silent, the weight of that truth settling into every corner of the room. Finally, Mrs. Halcombe spoke again, her voice quieter, steadier, as though digging through fear had uncovered something firmer beneath. "There is one more thing," she said. Holmes turned sharply. "Yes?" "In my husband's coat," she said, "I found a torn scrap of paper. I thought it nothing, a piece of rubbish he had used to wipe oil from his hands. But now I wonder. She reached into her apron and withdrew a small crumpled scrap. Holmes took it instantly, smoothing it across the bench. There, scribbled in the hurried stroke of a dying man, were 4 words. "Ask the apprentice again." Holmes's eyes widened, not in surprise, but in a kind of fierce, dawning certainty. "Watson," he said quietly, "the circle is closing, and the next link in the chain is Samuel Greaves."